Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn webinar, Dynamics NAV Upgrades, Expectations and Best Practices, brought to you by ArcherPoint. There's a lot of misinformation out there about NAV upgrades. Lengthy downtimes, costly overruns, lost customizations. I think we've heard them all, and I'm sure you probably have too. Today we're going to dispel these myths and teach you about ArcherPoint upgrade best practices in our hour together today. We're very fortunate to have three of our most experienced NAV upgrade experts with us. David Kopp is going to start us off. David began working with Dynamics NAV in 2005 as a software developer and immediately gravitated to upgrade practices and procedures. He has established himself as an expert in this area and has been a technical lead in the upgrade practice at ArcherPoint for the duration of his NAV career. John Long has an established track record of success in transitioning complex ERP systems from old to new technology. With a background in manufacturing and distribution as a business owner, John was naturally inclined to learn and become an expert in business software development using the latest languages. Since 2002, John has focused specifically on NAV and earned certifications from some of the best NAV experts in the industry. And last but definitely not least, Matt Traxinger has been working with Dynamics NAV since 2006. Over the years, he's worked as a developer, consultant, project manager, and support person. He has had the privilege to see NAV from many different views because of his experience working for companies that develop add-on products, traditional value-added reselling partners, and directly for end users. So without any further delay, David's going to kick us off. David, over to you.
All right, thanks, Suzanne, and I'll just say really excited to have the opportunity to meet with all of you today and kind of go over some things that we've learned over the years for ArcherPoint upgrades, and we'll definitely have some time at the end, a few minutes to answer some questions, so feel free to keep those, and we'll try to make some time at the end here. Some of the things that we try to focus on when we perform an upgrade are what things make up some of the best practices and key factors. We're going to go over some of those key factors. We're also going to talk about the pre-upgrade prep and estimation process. One key topic is what clients like to decide sometimes what customs to bring forward, and that can be pretty tricky sometimes. We're also going to talk about how to keep from adding new development during an upgrade, or how you risk mitigate for that. We'll also talk about the data migration aspect, getting from the old version to the new version. We'll also talk about the future of NAV, events and extensions, which is definitely in the current reality. And John will actually talk about the 4 phases of an upgrade and some key topics about the various menus and NAV pane versions between the old classic style, the NAV pane, and also the new RTC NAV pane. And then we'll definitely show you what's new with NAV as well. Matt's going to hit on those topics. And then we'll finish off with some Q&A. So the first thing that I usually like to consider when I'm talking about, doing the upgrades is your custom code. The custom code really is one of the most tricky aspects to really get a client to wrap their mind around what's the benefit of bringing that forward. And some people in the industry use the term code debt. I think I like to look at it from the term of code investment, because you've invested a certain amount of money over a period of years to customize NAV for your business processes. And the way NAV interacts, a lot of those customs, if there's been turnaround in the company, people don't really know that those customs may not be part of base NAV anymore. So I think one of the key misconceptions sometimes I hear with clients is, well, we just want to start off with base NAV, and they really don't understand how much of their customs they're actually using. So really one of the first starting points for us when we get a client that asks us that question is helping them to decide what are they using and what they need to carry forward. What's the appropriate balance between percentage of code and how much research that's actually going to take. How much they want to carry forward in the upgrade, do they want to remove those customs, or do they want to refactor those into events? Another aspect that we always look at is how many ISVs, how many of those third-party add-ons do they have? Are all of them active? Do those ISVs even exist anymore? Have any of them gone out of business? Are there any replacement add-ons? Like if one doesn't exist anymore, is another one out in the market that we have to migrate that to? Maybe for a credit card solution or a shipping solution. Another trick too with upgrades is, are any ISVs in restricted object ranges? Particularly if an ISV is in a 37 million range, that ISV has intentionally put that ISV in a range where it does make it harder for other partners to interact with those objects unless they are under contract with that ISV. So that's something to keep in mind, and it is an additional cost when you're upgrading. So that's also something to keep in mind when you add a new ISV. And then are there any add-ons that can be eliminated, either or customs that are replaced with new ISVs? Maybe there's customs that can be eliminated because there's replacements within the Microsoft product now. So those are all things that we're looking at in the beginning of the project. Obviously, a huge component too is database size. If you have a small database, maybe 25 to 100 gigabytes, normally those don't have any issues with running those go live migrations over a 2-day weekend. It's only when the database gets as large as 250, 500 gigabytes. We've even had one recently that was a terabyte of data, and we actually had to augment some ways to get that all down into a normal 2-day weekend. Things that we've done to address those kind of issues are we've actually created some in-house dimension caching processes or alterations to the dimension conversion process that convert dimensions, which was an architecture shift between the 2009 series and the 2013 series. Dimensions shifted in architecture on how they were tracked and recorded within NAV, and so there's an enormous conversion routine that we have to go through to convert those. And so a key for that is we've developed some processes that actually cut that runtime down by as much as even 90%. If you use the standard Microsoft process, it might take several days, whereas ours may cut it down to a matter of hours. One thing to keep in mind is after you do convert the dimensions, we've seen databases where 45% of the database size was dimensions, and that converted down to less than 1%. There's other things you can do too, like using date filtering on posted document tables, SQL scripts to remove large quantities of non-critical data. So there's other tricks in the tool bag that you can get the migration to fit within a normal 2-day weekend. Usually we start off with a survey of the client during our pre-upgrade prep and estimation to really get a sense of what the client needs, why are they even thinking about upgrading. It basically gives us what we need to know about the database so we'll scope it correctly. The client wants us to know them accurately, and that's our way to know their system and their processes accurately if they aren't our client already. Obviously, we're going to ask them all about the add-ons, any discontinued ones, how well of a track record does that add-on vendor have. So obviously that's a key aspect of it as well. And then you always have to know what version they're going from and to, database size, how many companies, and a big component of that is also current and future hardware. They have to be running on hardware sufficient enough to run the new version of NAV, including the hardware, the operating system, and the version of SQL. So those are all key aspects. Other data gathering that we do, we also pull all the modified and custom objects, which helps us scope the size of the object merge, which is probably one of the biggest components in an upgrade based on the number of modified and custom objects. We'll also pull the table information so that we can determine which records and which data a client's using. So that helps us give a snapshot of if they're using something like kitting, or if they're using service management, or they're using bombs. So that's a good way to see what data they actually have populated. We also built a custom in-house tool called the Field Checker, which actually lets us scan for custom fields in a database and produce a report based on that. And if we're running it on the client's database, we can actually get a sense for, what fields actually have data in them. So it's a good way to help the client identify what customization they're using. We also have kind of a standard but slightly modified report logging tool. There's some out there in the general NAV community. We use those, a couple slight modifications to it. That really gets to one of the key costs of an upgrade too, about report conversion costs, which those are probably the most expensive elements to convert between the older architectures and the new ones, from the classic report layouts to the RTC report layouts. And using a report logger helps you identify, say out of 200 reports that are modified or custom, maybe you're only still using 50 or 100 of those. Well, that definitely cuts down on the cost of an upgrade if you know exactly which reports you're even still using. We have had a couple clients which used what we called a data port logger. It's not something that's native ability within NAV, but we did develop a small code change if they had, say, 100 or 200 data ports and they had no way of knowing which ones they were using. We could make a standard small code change to actually log, data ports. But I don't generally see that people need that, because normally if they're using data ports, they know exactly which ones they're still using. And we also use a combination of the license permission report to identify customs that don't need to be upgraded that might be outside of a client's license. What we do with all that information is we basically pull it into a consolidated analysis document, which serves as a technical and a sales document. There's lots of components of that document that auto-calculate based on the raw data and additional factors to give us the true picture of the total number of hours and dollars within the different resource combinations and rates for the project. And that really helps us to identify from a sales perspective, what is the client getting and how much is it going to cost, how much is the time involvement. And it also serves as our technical document to know what are the gotchas within the project. The add-ons, the migration considerations, the object merging specs, all that kind of stuff. And it's good because it's a consolidated document that serves as a great sales tool, but it can be used as our SOW, the statement of work after the sales process is done. Another key consideration that we talked about slightly earlier, but I'll hit on a little bit more now, is how do we decide, when we bring customizations forward during the upgrade? And I like to tell clients it's usually a balancing act, because if the act of researching will be more costly than just bringing it all forward anyway, you usually have a break-even point with that amount of research. So if a client came to me and said, well, I'm using about 50% of my mods, well, there's a couple tricks that we can use to identify maybe custom objects, custom forms, custom pages, custom reports, and the like. But normally, generally speaking, with tables or code units, unless you're talking about, the 5% rule, which it may not be a hard and fast number, but if it takes 100 hours of additional research to vet out a certain percentage, but it's only 30 hours to bring all the customs forward, I got to think at some point that you have to make the case, it's not worth doing the research if the amount of merge effort in total is so minimal. So that is something we help clients look at. I mean, if they don't know, we have some tools like the field checker report to show them custom fields, and obviously the reports and data ports list. But you have to really continue to balance with how much effort am I going to spend researching the customs versus how much is it going to take just to upgrade it all, because we're using automated and semi-automated tools to bring those customs forward. Also the report logging tool, we talked about that already, in data port logging. So a lot of those things are really good tools for all of us to use. Let me go to the next slide here. All right. Yeah, the field checker tool, obviously a great way to spit out those custom fields. General rule, if they decide to eliminate all the custom fields, it's likely you can eliminate the rest of the custom code. And the reason I say that is because custom fields really drive a lot of customization and modification, as well as custom reports or modified reports or custom and modified data ports. So you get a sense when you're using the field checker to look for custom fields and the report usage and data port, whether the rest of the customization can get pulled out too, or at least that be the starting point. You may be able to add certain small things back in, but if a client came to me and said, yeah, I'm not using any of these custom fields and none of these custom reports and none of these data ports, that's probably a good sign they can just upgrade everything they have without having to go back and check that. Let's see, yeah, the field checker and the report logger help us decide about the low-hanging fruit. We do use Object Manager Advanced for where use scans. We have a couple people that, some people in our team that prefer using tools like Prism. They're both great tools for doing the where use scans. We use that during issue resolution. So that's good things to consider. Don't add too much to an upgrade. The balancing act with clients doing concurrent development is how much upgrade and customizations are they trying to do while we're trying to do an upgrade. I mean, the best case scenario is if you can keep from doing any concurrent development, that's great, because always when you do concurrent development, you have to always sync up that code into the new database as well. So if a client is just about to implement a huge new project and they want to do an upgrade too, sometimes we've suggested them maybe you serialize that, do your get that project in first, and then we'll start the upgrade, because if there's so much extra concurrent syncing of objects between the current project that's not live yet and an upgrade, your costs just go up. So you do have to balance that, how much syncing you want between two different projects that are running in parallel. Obviously, adding and removing whole add-ons during an upgrade, I tend to suggest to clients don't do that. And the reason is, if you're not doing it now, why add that as part of an upgrade? Now, sometimes we'll add a new add-on but not make it fully operational until after the upgrade, which that seems reasonable. Like if they wanted to add a credit card solution but they're not using one now, we may go ahead and merge that in, but we may not make it fully operational until after the upgrade. So those adding new ones, not quite so much of a problem. If it doesn't have to be tied to the upgrade, it just makes it less risky. So, the saying with me is, if your parallel project can kill an upgrade cycle, because if you form too many dependencies, then it can just delay everything. Other things we look for are trying to do code freezes. That's always good. People doing development simultaneously, that we try to stay away from. We do try to do a timeline of object sync-ups between production and the upgrade database and test. And we also try to keep, good dev and test environments so we can keep concurrent development separated out pretty well. Some of the topics for data migration are, hardware definitely plays a critical role, especially for larger databases. Sometimes we've had to use solid-state drives because the lower non-solid state ones just don't have enough, performance on them. You definitely want sufficient memory and CPU speed. If you can't use solid-state drives, are you using the faster RPM drives? Do you have enough disk space allocated? So what that means is your production needs for a database may be different than the upgrade needs. We might need to keep 2 or 3 databases active at once just for different levels of testing. You might have concurrent development going on. So just because you have enough space for one production database doesn't necessarily mean you have the right specs for an upgrade. And so that's things we try to cover as well with the clients. We basically use the Microsoft Quick Guide as our starting point. We use that because it's a good way to document everything we encounter during the test migration. We revise it for each upgrade client specific to their individual database. We do keep a set of time metrics that allows us to measure and further revise down anything that's running too long, because obviously the goal is to get it within a 2-day window. So that's a huge aspect as well. We do have common steps we replicate between different quick guides that we use in all of our different upgrades. And we try to identify alternate resources that can be the backup if someone, for some reason, cannot run on a particular weekend. One thing we've done, too, is start merging some of the migration toolkits together from Microsoft. so we can make bigger jumps without having to go through plateau versions of NAV. You know, how do we handle custom fields in an upgrade with more than one jump in NAV version? You know, Microsoft makes their toolkits to go from point A to point B, but they may not go back a certain distance. So to get to NAV 2017, their toolkit only goes back to 2013. So if you're starting from NAV 5 or 2009, a 2009 toolkit might get you up to 2013, but then you have to use a different toolkit to get to 2017. So some of that, we use the field checker process to identify those custom fields that we have to move forward. Sometimes in the past, we've just done the 2 independent migrations to get through what I call a plateau version, like a middle version. Sometimes we'll use temp tables, but I think a more common strategy we've used currently is actually merging toolkits together. So that seems to work pretty well. One topic I'll just dive into real quick here is the extensions and future of NAV. Yeah, what to expect as issues. I think, you know, that continues to evolve and vet out, you know, events. The extensions aspect of NAV is, you know, a different look and feel of NAV as far as like how you install objects and what you can modify. You know, there can be issues with data migration. If you go from on-premise to extension, there can be issues with updating the extensions if there needs to be any bug fixes. You know, how quickly can you actually get an extension bug fixed or updated? The ability to customize an add-on extension, that can be a little bit more tricky than the classic version of NAV that's non-extension based. You know, is it worthwhile to convert a customer from traditional to extension? My feeling on that is probably not, at least yet. I don't think it's good enough to convert over to the fully extension-based solution if you're already on traditional. Can you start out that way? Maybe, but you know, there may not be a good enough case to make for it right now. What types of customers are good as extension candidates? Yeah, pages, published events. So that, you know, if you're really interested, we might have to have a deeper conversation about that so you can kind of get more of the nitty-gritty behind those details. So I'm going to turn it over to John Long right now, and he's going to start off with the 4 phases of an upgrade. So John, take it away.
Hello. You can go to the next slide, and this will give you a summary of all 4 phases, and I'll deep dive into each one on the next subsequent slides. But the 4 phases are object merge, and the deliverable is all the upgraded code completely merged in with all the ISVs and the customizations. And then we start the data migration, and the deliverable of that phase is the test database. And if you look at the swim lines, we'll look at it a little bit closer on the subsequent slides, but the swim line, each phase is broken into 2 different swim lines. The top one is the activity that the client is generally accountable for, and then behind the scenes ArcherPoint is doing all the merge work and the migration work for the migration phase. Once the test database is delivered, that's when the client gets most active, and it's essentially testing every single process that you do on a daily, monthly, and quarterly and annual basis. And we have a 24-hour team of developers that are around the clock fixing defects. So it's pretty rapid turnaround, rapid technology, or rapid development. And then the final phase is go live, and essentially the same type of engagement as the test phase, where issues are reported and developers are fixing them as fast as possible. And you can go to the next slide. So the merge phase is largely it can be anywhere from a couple days to, I've seen it as long as 4 months, depending on the complexity of your customizations and the number of ISVs. And you'll see in subsequent slides how ISVs can make the merge plan a little bit more complex. But we always have a kickoff meeting. We have an internal kickoff meeting where we go over the SOW that Dave was talking about earlier. It's essentially a design document and a roadmap for the entire project. It lists key factors that we use for the merging, the migration, everything from, you know, the reports that we're upgrading, the companies that we're upgrading, if there's any nuances, company changes, etc., old version, new version, database size. It's a really comprehensive SOW, borderline design document. So we go over that with the client, and we go over all the accountabilities and roles that that Archer Point upgrade teams fill and are accountable for, and then we also help define the client's accountabilities and roles and who's going to fill them and all that good stuff. And at that point, there really isn't too much for the client to do except for the infrastructure. We can't start the second phase until the infrastructure is complete. So a lot of times we might even get the infrastructure conversation started before the kickoff meeting, because it's largely independent of any other part of the project, except for it is a dependency on the data conversion. This phase is all done on our Archer Point server using our merge tools. The infrastructure is, you know, from a classic to RTC, you're going from a, you know, a single tier architecture to 3-tier architecture. So there's in a classic RTC upgrade, there's always infrastructure purchases, requisitions involved, and sometimes it can get expensive, and it can be a lengthy process. So if the merge takes 4 months, it's not that critical to get the infrastructure ready. But if the merge is a 2-day process, then we like to get the infrastructure started weeks before that merge even starts. And during this time, we also have meetings, bi-weekly meetings to discuss the progress. But all right, the merge phase, we take all the objects, all the customizations, and we run it through a tool. Automatically merges 65% of the code. And that does get better as we start doing RDC to RTC upgrades, because when we merge code, we try to leave it in better condition than it was previously. But on average, we see 65% of it is automatic, which means it hardly takes any time at all to merge that. If there are any conflicts, the tools mark those objects as conflicts, and we have to modify the code to fit in with the Microsoft's new code base or any of the ISV code bases. And then rewrites are customizations that perhaps were to Microsoft code that was either removed or heavily modified or refactored by them. So we'll go through it, perhaps even revisit the original spirit of the requirement. Sometimes we might strip it out. Sometimes it's code that just doesn't make sense anymore. All right, next slide. So I just want to touch briefly. I know this is the purpose of our meeting is to kind of get you excited about upgrades and just give you a heads up on what to expect. And this is probably a little bit deep dive, but just to give you an idea of what we're looking at with customizations, the big circle represents all base nav code, and that little circle represents the customizations of a typical database. We're mostly exclusively interested in the delta. That's what we have to merge. So we're only looking at the customizations, and we identify that using various tools and even manual analysis. You can go to the next slide, and this will be a little more complex scenario where we have multiple add-ons, where the customizations are actually within the add-ons, where, say, a LANA ship was modified by the client. In some cases, the ISV modifies base nav as well, and there's customizations within base nav within that add-on. So it can get pretty complex, but again, all we're doing is we're trying to identify the delta, and then we take that delta and put it into the tool. You can go to the next slide, please. So here's a representation of at least 8 add-ons here with customizations. What we'll do is we'll start off, so each one of these bars represents a merge plan. So in this case, there's 8 different merges that we'll do, 8 different deltas that we'll identify and put through the merge tool. We always start off with the largest delta. For instance, NAV 2017 with Lanham, they actually delivered their product with their Lanham already merged in with NAV 2017. So we'll start off with the largest delta, and then we'll keep working up to the smallest. We usually leave the customs for last, even if they aren't the smallest, just because they tend to be the most difficult to merge. A lot of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. Next slide, please. So phase 2, once we get the merged code, then we can do the data migration. In most cases, the data migration requires the new code to even run the migration steps, especially with custom field data. During this time, we'll get the license, the new license. We can start setting up clients. They can start using a Acronis database for training. But for the most part, there's not a lot for the client to do at this point. So we recommend if there's anybody taking PTO, that you should take your PTO before the test database is delivered, because that's when it'll get busy with the client activity. During this time, the Archer Point is, number 1, focusing on delivering the test database. The multi-step iterations task here is to get the runtime down within a 48-hour period, ideally. We like to get it down below 40 hours. In some cases, it's 4 hours, but in some cases, it might run for 30 days before we actually get all the dimensions processed and everything. I mean, literally a 40-hour or a 40 to 15, 20-day runtime is not out of the ordinary. But we will deliver the test database once that process is run, and then we'll go back and do our multi-step iteration to add our dimension caching, all sorts of different workarounds that we use. We use dynamic indexing. So we've never failed to get a runtime down within a 2-day weekend. In the past, we considered 3-day weekends just to have that extra time, but we found that that's not necessary, and it actually causes problems when we're trying to schedule a go live when people are taking a PTO or whatever. So we always avoid holiday weekends, 3-day weekends. We always do it on a normal 2-day weekend where everybody's available for at least for the go live. So this process not only is delivering the test database, but it's proving out the runtime of the go live itself. All right, next slide. And I already talked about this stuff, but Dave talked about the RAM and disk requirements. Sometimes that, even with our best guesses pre-project, we still might make additional requests for additional hard drive space, faster drives, etc., more RAM, depending on what we find during the multi-iteration process to get the runtime down. Next slide. So now we've delivered the test database, and this, I do need to modify this slide because the report development actually needs to happen before user testing. In the past, we have delivered the test database before report development was complete. Some clients, they don't really care about the reports being completely done, but a lot of them do, and we've just found it best, even if they don't care, to just wait till all the reports are completely developed and QA'd. And we have an expert team of report developers that's all they do is develop reports and QA reports. And we've found that in the past that the report defects were a large piece of the pie of the defects. So we really focused on that, and now our reports are delivered almost 100% defect-free. Once testing starts, the users test, we fix. It's simple, but it's usually the most intense part of the project. Things pop up that you would never expect. External interfaces, permission problems, things are broken because of a customization, or there might even be just a process that the client doesn't agree with, that we might even have to add additional customizations that might be completely out of scope of the upgrade project. Once no blockers exist, we decide that we're going to go live. A lot of times the go live is predetermined, but a lot of times the go live has to really coincide with the lack of defects, or at least a comfortable amount that perhaps could be resolved after go live. During this time, we're having weekly meetings discussing the defects. A lot of interaction between the client and ArcherPoint's upgrade team, specifically the project manager and the tech lead. And we can go to the next slide. So testing, I'm not going to go into this that much. I put the slides on here so that you can read them later. And I want to make sure Matt has some time, and Christina as well, to talk about some other things. So I'm just going to leave it at that. So Dave, if you could go through these slides. Again, more testing. It'd be good for you to read through this, but I'm not going to go through it with any detail. So you can go to the next slide, Dave, until you get to my final phase 4 slide.
The one takeaway here is that testing is key.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's why I left it in here, and you can stop right here at this slide. I left it in there because testing is the key to successful go live. Role centers and testing now, this is kind of a unicorn topic, and I won't go into too much detail, but I did write a blog on it, and you can Google it. But personalizations and customizations are something that everybody wants to do, coming from classic to RTC. But it always is something that bogs down the upgrade. So I always caution to not, even though the RTC, one of the most compelling reasons to go to the RTC client is role center customizations. It can be a bottleneck in your timeline of your upgrade. So I guess I'll just keep it at that for now. RTC to RTC is no big deal because personalizations and profile configurations already exist. So clients usually like to just keep them intact. All right, next slide. So this just goes into a little bit more of the caveats of spending too much time on your configurations. The menu system is completely different in RTC, but what's not different is the way that you put things into the menu. The menu suite still exists, and in Object Designer, if you've ever added anything to the menu, that is exactly the same, even in 2017. Whatever's in that menu will show up in your directory and will show up in your search. So that's all I'm going to add here. You can read through this if you download the slide later. So you can go to the next slide, please, Dave. So this is just an example of Microsoft. You could Google around and find all sorts of different ideas on how to customize your role centers, but this was just a screenshot of one of them. They show all the groups in the back, and then they show what the screen looks like in profile configuration mode. And like I said, you can go nuts. I've seen clients spend a year on their role centers before they go live, which I don't recommend. So go to the next slide, please. More testing. Let's go to the next slide. More testing, and you can go to the next slide. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide. So my point of all these slides isn't that I was ever going to talk about them in a session, but that testing is very important. And I bulleted a lot of things that will help you in an upgrade. But testing is never done. But when it's done enough, we go live. And I think the next slide should be phase 4. And it's not. So go live best practices. This is another slide that you can mull over at your leisure. But basically, we want to get it down to a 48-hour runtime. We do everything possible to mitigate risks. Servers shutting down at 2 a.m. on a Friday night when we're trying to run the dimension cache process, for instance. So we do recommend mock go lives on a weekend, and there's just nothing that we do to mitigate risk during the go live weekend. And up to this date, we've never had to roll back one. We've never had a complete failure. So I think combined, Dave and I have done about 300 upgrades over the past 10 years. So the risk mitigation is working. You can go to the next slide, Dave. So phase 4, we go live, and again, we're on call 24 hours a day. We make sure, because it's in production, that we have an increased rapid response time, but it is similar to the test phase where users submit tickets through our system, on our real simple online system, and our developers pick them up and fix them as fast as they possibly can. Usually the post-go live defect resolution is small to none, but sometimes there are issues, and it's in direct relationship to how much testing was done. Usually the things that are issues after go live are things that weren't tested. So typically it's about 4 weeks, and then we have a project close meeting, and that's it. Sorry to rush through that. I'll let Matt take over now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave and John. So, Dave and John, went through what to expect during the upgrade, and kind of my job here is to inform you about why would you want to upgrade? You know, you're not just going to do it because you want to. You have to have a compelling reason to actually kind of go through that process from start to finish. And for me, you know, I always try to boil it down to something simple, and you know, the reason to upgrade is because you want to make life easier for all of your users. You know, that's typically the reason you're trying to upgrade. You want to, you know, get improvements in some process, or you know, just give a little bit of time back in the day for your employees. So we're going to go through a few of the new features. We still talk about new features since the Classic client, because there's still a lot of users that are still on the Classic version of NAV, but we'll hit some of the high points that that are new since NAV 2009 came out. So the first one we'll talk about, everybody always wants to know, you know, is my performance going to be better when I upgrade? I'm not going to say 100% yes, it is, but you know, 99.9% of the time, yes, you will absolutely have better performance when you upgrade to, you know, NAV 2016 or NAV 2017. There's less traffic on the network because all of the code has been moved to be to execute on the NAV server, that middle machine there in the diagram. So because there's less traffic going back and forth on the network, less code executing on the end user's machines, that means that the client side performance is going to be better. And then just also, you know, Microsoft has dedicated SQL teams, just like there's a dedicated NAV team to make improvements to NAV. There's a dedicated SQL team that, you know, makes improvements to SQL that NAV gets to leverage as it moves along in its versions. So, you know, improved data caching. It's easier to filter on flow fields because of the way that NAV can interact with SQL now. At multiple active result sets that come from SQL and go to NAV. Just there's a ton of performance improvements in the product, and this one and all of the other slides I'll have, we could easily spend an hour, you know, going into, you know, all the details behind all of them, but we're going to try to cover them all here pretty quick. So the next one is about events, which was mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation. So the old way of modifying your code to make improvements to it, we would just add code straight to the base NAV object. You know, that was the best practice, you know, before NAV 2016. On the next slide, you'll see that is no longer the best practice. So instead of adding that code in the same place that we did before, what Microsoft has done is essentially put these hooks into the base objects that we can tie into as developers. So there's all these hooks for things like when the customer exceeds their credit limit, or before you release a sales document in this example, or after you post a purchase order, or after you insert a GL entry, things like that. And we can segregate the code into completely standalone objects, and then NAV just knows how to tie into those based on how it's hooked in to the base objects. So this is what is going to eventually you know, lead to that cheaper upgrade, because the object merge time is going to go down significantly. Testing, of course, is never going to go away, but we can't start doing this until you get upgraded to NAV 2016. And so once you get there, that's again when you're going to start being able to see some kind of dramatic cost reductions in your upgrade. Then the next slide is about workflows. So workflows is a new feature that is available to everybody. Here you can see a few of the sales and marketing and sales workflows that come out of the box, but there's also workflows that are with purchasing and finance and things like that. So a workflow is essentially when this happens, if certain conditions are met, then it's going to do something else. And so I think if you hit enter one more time, you'll get a second diagram that or image that will show up that will show the detail behind one of these workflows. All of the major parts of the system are tied in, so workflows are built on top of those events that I just mentioned. So when a sales order gets released, if you want to perform a specific action, when that happens, you can do that. You can't just build a workflow on anything out of the box, but again, all the major parts of the system are in there for you to build a workflow on. And the nice part is if you need to build a custom workflow, because it does rely on those events, it actually forces you to build it outside of the base NAV objects. So there is no object merge time for custom events when you upgrade, or custom workflows rather. When you upgrade, they all just move forward to the next version. The next slide talks about the data exchange framework. This is a way for to do common integrations with NAV. So, currently every integration to an outside product is built a little bit differently. Some of them use web services, some of them use direct SQL calls, some of them use flat file transfers. There's a bunch of different ways to integrate, but with the data exchange framework, while it doesn't limit you to integrating this way, it does provide a common interface for everything to go through, and that will allow developers and people who configure these types of integrations to, because they have a common framework, it's easier to understand, easier to learn from one integration and transfer that knowledge to another one. And there's quite a few that come out of the box. A lot of these are for EU companies, but there's integrations for exchange rates and positive pay for Citibank and Bank of America. So if you've got a positive pay customization, you can strip that out and use the base NAV positive pay that's built on top of the data exchange framework now. The next slide is about BI and reporting. So reporting, it's a lot better than what the classic client reporting was. It's not, just your traditional black and white reports. You may have seen a lot out there that says it's more complicated, but and while it is slightly more complicated to develop, a lot of that is because it's we're learning something new. We've seen the development time on these types of reports go down dramatically, over the years since they've been introduced. But you can easily print to Word and Excel, PDF. You can schedule a report to run every day and be delivered into your role center or your email. So if you're used to having to customize reports and put that checkbox on the options tab for print to Excel, you don't have to do that anymore. All reports go to Excel out of the box automatically, go to Word automatically. And then, we've also seen a big upshift in using external reporting systems for like Power BI and Jet reports for a lot of the financial reporting and just business intelligence reporting. There's a lot easier kind of integration to NAV for that. Only a couple more. Next one is about email. If you can believe it, we couldn't email an invoice out of the box up until a few versions ago. So now that we can print to PDF, we can easily attach that to an email and send that out automatically. There's a post and send button on orders, or just a send as email button on orders now. It's really easy to use. So we do have that feature now, make everybody's life in AR and AP a little bit easier. Next one is client options. We've always had the traditional Windows client that we use on our desktops at work, but we also have the phone client, the web client, and the tab client now. You'll see these in a lot of demos that Microsoft puts out. The web client is really where the product is moving. A lot of us see those demos for Microsoft, and we think they're just kind of the snazzy demo that no one's ever gonna use, but shows off the product well. But the web client, it can do everything that the Windows client can do, and you can do all of your work on the go, so to speak. So there's a lot more options besides just kind of sitting at your desk at work. And then the last one, we don't want to forget about our friends in finance, preview posting, something we've all wanted for a long time. Click the preview posting button on any document or journal in the system, and then you can see ahead of time what ledger entries are going to get hit, what your posted documents are going to look like. You can see that before you actually hit the post button. There's a lot of other financial improvements as well, but to me that's the nicest one, the one I use most often. So now we're close to running out of time, Suzanne, I can turn it back over to you and let you take it from here.
Great. I do want to mention just briefly that it's once you do make the big jump and get on the latest release, that's a time to consider getting into a pattern or a certain cadence for your upgrades. One of the things that ArcherPoint's considering is are planning to offer here in the short term as an opportunity to subscribe to upgrades, right? So to make that an operating expense versus a capital expense. So if you're interested in that, just let us know afterwards. We do have a couple questions. Jim would like to know, what are typical infrastructure hurdles that need to be addressed during upgrades? So not sure who wants to take that out of our panelists, but the typical infrastructure hurdles that should be addressed during upgrades, or maybe prior to.
Yeah, one of the biggest ones is, your current version of, your operating system, your box, your SQL version, those may not all work with the later version of NAV. So if you're on NAV 5, NAV 2009, we have a spec sheet that gives the minimum requirements from Microsoft for the OS, SQL, and hardware needs. But typically we have found we had to bump those up because they're the absolute bare minimum, and they're not really a good idea of what you need to function. It's just literally the base bottom of the barrel minimum requirement. So we've kind of developed our own document that lists what is the recommended level of CPU, memory, hard drives, the box, the operating system, SQL version. So that's definitely, we try to do like an infrastructure call at the beginning of a project or even before a project begins, just to help a client understand what the hardware needs are, specific to the version of NAV they're going to. So hope that answered your question. Suzanne, any others?
Yes, we have 2 more questions. We might run over here just a moment, so if you guys can stay on, great. If not, we'll send you the recording. Next question comes from Giovanni. How much of an effort is it with security from users coming over, I guess, to migrate your existing security during an upgrade?
Normally the security is still kind of the same between the old versions, the classic versions, and the RTC versions. They do have some migration tools we use to migrate it as long as they're using the Microsoft's, security tables, kind of like what John mentioned. We do have to do some measure amount of tweaking to that. But one of the things we do advocate is when we deliver the test database, you may be about 90% there based on what you were using before, but you're still going to have to make some changes. So once you've made those changes in the test database, the new test database, we can move those then at go live from the test database over to the go live database. So any security changes you've made in your setup, normally we can move those over between tests then to go live.
All right. Next question is, can canned reporting or Power BI replace JET?
Matt, you want to take that one?
Sure. It's kind of a tough question. Power BI is still what I'll call an up-and-coming product. I don't work with either one of them all that much, so I don't know that I have the best informed opinion. I think one day Power BI might be able to replace JET, but I don't think it's probably there yet.
Yeah, and then one of the things we talk about is using them together, right?
Mm-hmm.
To visualize JET data using Power BI. And Jim, we'll follow up with you afterwards as well. I think the last question that we have, and thanks everybody for staying on in just a minute more, are the workflows included in the upgrade, or are they additional options?
That's you, Matt.
The base workflows will be part of the system during the upgrade, but as far as customizing those workflows or anything like that, that wouldn't be part of the upgrade.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Linda. Workflows are included in the latest release, but again, I think they have a certain set, right, Matt, that are
Mm-hmm.
that are
yeah.
developed right for you, just some base workflows.
Yeah, there's a set primarily around document and journal approvals.
Great. Hey, I want to thank our audience. Thanks for the great questions. Thank you to our panel. Lots of great information. We appreciate your time. Please feel free to give us your feedback at info@archerpoint.com. Again, info@archerpoint.com. Thanks everyone for your time, and this concludes today's session. Have a great rest of your day.